Hi, everyone. Mindshare Partners published a report on the state of workplace mental health for older workers. To offer his perspective, I have Doug Dickson on the line. Doug is the co-founder and secretary of the Encore Network, a coalition of leaders, activists, and professionals that work to remove barriers and advance opportunities for people over 50 through community building, education, and advocacy. Thank you for joining us, Doug.
Thank you, Bernie. This is an important topic. I'm happy to be here.
So you've been advocating for people over 50 for well over 15 years and just at the Encore Network alone. When it specifically comes to workplace mental health, obviously, what feels most important to know now?
Well, I think the place you start in terms of workplace mental health, and in fact, mental health generally for older adults, is the impact of ageism and age discrimination. And that happens in a couple of ways. One is the things that happen to people and the things that people do to themselves, internalized ageism and the impacts that has. In terms of the workplace, though, I think the first place to start is how pervasive ageism is, both in terms of how it's perceived by older adults, but also how behaviors and actions affect the mental health of older workers. Something like 2/3, and there are a number of studies that reinforce this data, and there are lots of numbers, but they coalesce around about 2/3 of people say that they have either seen or experienced age discrimination in the workplace. And what that does is to create a kind of cloud around people, right? It affects the way they behave, the way that they are seen by others. It affects the opportunities that they have that are made available to them, and it affects judgments and decisions that are made by others that have a direct effect on individuals. Thinking about ageism and the kind of burden, the psychic burden that it creates, is a lot like being at a stoplight or approaching a stoplight that's yellow, right? And it never turns. You're constantly in that yellow zone. You're never free to go. And the stop comes at some point, but you don't know when it's going to come. And so what that creates is this feeling of being disposable. It creates a feeling of being vulnerable. It affects your confidence. It affects your esteem. It makes you sort of constantly and quietly vigilant. You're monitoring what you say, what you do. You're concerned about the impact and about the perception that others have. So there's this kind of chronic stress that overhangs your existence. And if you pay too much attention to that, then that affects your performance, right? If you don't pay enough attention to it, then you get surprises. And then all of a sudden, you're forced to pay attention to it in a way that you may not have expected. So the consequence of this is kind of a low grade chronic stress, a low grade alert that you're sort of always trying to manage. It affects your credibility, or at least you may sense that it affects your credibility. And ultimately, that has a payoff, right? That affects, how you regard yourself, but also your mental health. It contributes to perhaps initially a feeling of languishing, is a relatively new term that I think we're learning about. But then, more challenging and difficult experiences leading to perhaps anxiety, depression, in some cases, increased alcohol abuse or use, disruptive sleep patterns, all of the things that contribute to ill health and ultimately shortened lives. So I think that's the place where you have to start in terms of mental health, in terms of older adults, older workers. But then that plays out, in terms of its effect on opportunity. And it's well documented that older adults in the workplace tend to be offered fewer opportunities as they age. They're certainly offered fewer training and development opportunities, so there's a lower level of investment in older workers. It contributes to a feeling of marginalization in the workplace. Sometimes people are not selected for projects and teams and that sort of thing as they grow older. There's a fear on the part of some employers that, or individuals making those decisions, that someone will be gone, right? That they'll decide to leave. And we can talk about that in a moment as well. But there's also a greater tendency for organizations to see older workers as the prime candidates for layoffs when those decisions come. And sometimes there's a perception that older workers are hostile. And if you don't look at productivity and a lot of the other factors that should be a part of that calculation, yes, they may be more costly, but they also take a lot of knowledge out the door when they leave, and the impact on the workplace is certainly felt in their absence.
Excellent. I really like that you name the elements of this quiet vigilance, I think earlier on, which certainly impacts how an individual shows up at work. And definitely highlighting that some of the things that employers or people mistakenly notice as, oh, this is an age thing, is really about this, how you're treating them thing. And this kind of, I like that you talk about cumulative effects of the quiet exclusion, the lack of support, and these cumulative effects, not just on individuals, but businesses around losing institutional knowledge, some of their most productive team members, and a lot of these actions being informed by misconceptions. And so you end up with this huge pool of untapped talent when many kind of older workers do want to work and find a lot of benefits. And so those benefits apply again, both to the individual and the organization. So my next question is, since you've kind of started the Encore network, or even at the start of your career compared to today, what have you seen as the biggest changes for older workers when it comes to mental health and well-being, and what's at risk now?
Well, I'll start. I'll look back a little ways. If you, I don't think you want me to look back the whole 50, 60 years. But what's happened more recently is that as the markets have tightened up, as the economy has become more uncertain, as AI, for example, has created a promise yet to be delivered of higher productivity. There's a lot of there are a lot of decisions being made by employers that they need to make adjustments. And we've seen the effect of that in terms of, certainly in terms of larger companies, huge layoffs, certainly in terms of the federal government, given what's happening there. It has been less true in small business and medium-sized businesses, but there still is this impression of that your jobs are vulnerable now, right? And a kind of a sense of a frozen market. I heard a number recently that said something like a third of people have seen layoffs, and more than that, approaching 40% have seen hiring freezes in the companies that they work for. And what that looks like from the outside, what that looks like from the inside is you better hang on, right? And of course, there's that added tension. What it looks like from the outside is, how am I ever going to get back? There are some things that are happening in the workforce that are promising, and I think it's fair to mention that the advantages of mixed age work teams are beginning to be documented and understood. And in fact, teams that have both younger and older workers are immensely more productive and immensely more innovative. Those teams are immensely more stable. Younger people stay in the organization longer when they work side by side with older adults. Um, and profitability is greater. So with those statistics, it's hard to imagine why any employer would stick with the old biases. And of course, we're talking about mental health. So the mental health benefits, both to younger workers and to older workers, is immense because there is psychological safety. They don't, older workers don't have to wait and tell somebody at the last minute that they've made a decision to retire, which leaves the company holding the bag in terms of any kind of transition. But older workers wouldn't do that unless they had a sense of safety, right? Otherwise, they would be lame ducked, and there would be even less of an opportunity for them.
Perfect. As we know, the future feels ever more unpredictable. You've already mentioned, skills-based hiring, ways to bridge workers across generations, whether that be through mentorships, intentional policies around retention, and pathways for phased retirement. Kind of in this day and age, are there any other kind of programs or strategies or efforts that you kind of see as the best way to support older workers in today's labor market or addresses the most pressing needs?
Well, I think that this notion of culture is critical because I think that's the place where you have an opportunity to change attitudes, right? If it's left to individuals, then individuals will do what they're going to do, right? They'll be influenced by a whole range of factors. But in an organization, when there is a culture that encourages sharing, that encourages uh, learning from each other, um, then I think there's an opportunity for a kind of peer pressure to develop, right? And I don't mean that in a negative way. We usually think of peer pressure as negative, but I think in this sense it can be positive because there's encouragement for people to learn and to think differently and to behave differently as a result. And you reinforce that with policies, and you reinforce that with practices that flow from the culture that you want to create. Um, but I think ultimately, the culture of an organization driven by leadership, driven by the interests of employees, is probably the thing that will make the most difference. It's hard to force these things from the top, I think, because as soon as the leader leaves, the person who's taken that responsibility, then there's a tendency for a kind of reversion to happen, right? Back to the norm. Whereas when you change the everyday behaviors and those become the norm, uh, the leadership is still important, but it's less essential for the kind of long-term change that I think we all believe is useful and helpful.
Yeah, I love that you're naming culture because even though it feels very amorphous, it's a good summation of, yes, it may be leadership driven and sometimes those leaders leave, and balancing that with the everyday behaviors. And sometimes you need also systems and policies that enable or incentivize those individual behaviors that ultimately end up supporting kind of the well-being, not just of older workers, but everyone, frankly. So thank you so much for your time today, Doug. For our viewers, you can download Mindshare Partners report on older workers' mental health at work using the link in the comments or description section below. Thank you all for watching, and certainly thank you, Doug, for your time and for your perspective.
Appreciate it. Thank you.